we have now focused on really looking at the end-to-end customer experience, and it needs to be proactive, preventive, and engaging across the entire customer experience. So we're then going to talk a bit about how you analyze and measure the customer experience in non-traditional ways, and I'll be giving you sort of a checklist. All this is in my book, Customer Experience 3.0, which is on Amazon for less than 20 bucks. Now, the basis for a lot of our research first started with the White House study that was conducted in 1976. And what we did was we asked customers, a cross-section of the U.S. population, have you had any problems? And if so, what was the most serious problem? Did you complain? And how well did that come out? And what we found was that a significant percentage of customers didn't complain, but if they didn't complain, they were significantly less loyal. But if they complained and were satisfied, they were much more loyal. And there was a guy from General Electric sitting in the audience who said, gee, maybe we should talk to our customers. And he went back and set up the GE Answer Center. And from there, we worked with American Express and Toyota and actually helped roll out the concept of 800 numbers to the North American marketplace. Now, we've been replicating that study every 2 years with what we call the National Rage Study, which is what makes people so angry they start swearing at a company. And things have changed in some ways, but they've not changed in others. What we are now finding is there are actually more serious problems, but they've changed. They're no longer automobile, banking, and household appliance. They are now technology-based. Your internet, your cell phone, and your computers are what drive people nuts. But interestingly enough, we still find that about 20% of people, for their most serious problem over the last year, never complained to anyone due to it was going to be too much hassle and it wasn't going to do any good anyway. And what's also bad is that 2/3 of the people who did complain basically at the end of the day said, I got nothing. And so we're finding that the cynicism about why bother complaining still exists. And the other thing that was interesting was that we, in the past with automobiles and appliances, when we asked people how much money would you have lost if this problem was not solved, it was many hundreds or in fact thousands of dollars. This time around, the results were that the average loss was only $160, and we said, wow, that's weird. That doesn't sound like a big problem. But they then went on to say, I wasted an average of 5 hours trying to resolve this problem. So we're now finding that it's more the money than, it's more the time wasted than the money. And that's what really makes people angry and makes them end up swearing at a company. Now, just a trivia fact, we, for fun, asked, what's your political affiliation? And what we found was that independents swear at companies a lot more than Democrats, who in turn swear at companies a lot more than Republicans. You can interpret that any way you want. The other interesting finding was that while the Internet is now the rage, when people have a serious problem, 7 times as many pick up the phone as send an email. And about 16% of people go face-to-face. So the bottom line conclusion is that service is no better now than it was in 1976. People are very angry about convenience and time wasted, and when they're really upset, they pick up the phone and call. So your phone system still is dramatically more important than your internet service system in a lot of ways. Now, in terms of, let me see if I can get this to go to the next. We then asked people, well, what did you want? And we found a couple of interesting things. Certainly people want their product repaired, they want the problem fixed, and they want their money back. But 2 things that are as important, if not more important, is they wanted an assurance from the front line that the problem would not be repeated. And they also wanted an explanation as to why the problem occurred, and they wanted empathy in terms of, I want you to walk in my shoes. Now, what we find is that most frontline service staff don't feel that they are in a position to give you an assurance that the problem will not be repeated, and in fact many times they're confident it will happen again, and in many cases they're not in a position to give you an explanation as to why the problem occurred. So if your staff person is immediately moving to, okay, we got to fix this issue and you got your money back, we're done, you have not really responded to what the customers want. And if they don't get those other aspects, if you drop down to the bottom of this chart, you notice the word revenge. That's when people start going social, is when they have had some of their needs ignored. Now, we've also identified some other annoying processes that I'm sure none of the participants in this webinar are doing. The first is that when you're calling on the phone and you're on hold, you're told for faster service, go to the website. Well, in fact, our data shows 90% of people have already been to the website, and the reason they're calling is that they couldn't find their answer on the website. So that's gasoline on the fire. Also, being told your call is important to us, the fact I'm getting that message tells me and confirms that your call is not all that important. Hiding the 800 number channel. Gee, if we don't give them the 800 number explicitly, they'll go to the website. Well, they've already been there, and now they're angry that they can't find the 800 number easy. Also, hours of operation, you need to be available to the customer when they are reading your statement or using your product, even if that's 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And by the way, a lot of this applies in a business-to-business environment. We are finding that while people assume businesses behave more rationally than consumers, in fact, we find the non-complaint rate for business-to-business is actually higher in many cases than consumers, because I got to keep doing business with that sales rep, so I don't want to complain about that sales rep, and I'm dependent on that service technician, so I don't want to complain about that service technician. So we actually find that the non-complaint rates are higher in a lot of business environments than in consumer environments. And then finally, my favorite is that when the frontline representative has not assisted you on the original reason for your call, they will then cheerily say, oh, is there anything else I can do for you, when in fact they haven't helped you with the original. Now again, none of the participants in this webinar would do any of those things. Now, 6 basic concepts from the book. First, and this becomes important for voice of the customer and listening to customer feedback. First, we find that staff is not to blame for most issues. People assume that Mary Lou, the frontline rep, must have caused the problem, but in fact Mary Lou more than likely told the customer exactly what she was told to tell the customer. That just didn't make the customer happy. And so we find the primary causes are broken processes, marketing and sales incorrectly setting expectations, and we also find customers cause 20 to 30% of all their own problems. And that's the segmentation that your voice of the customer system should be looking at in terms of root cause analysis. Now, frontline staff need the flexibility and empowerment, and they have to be able to give you a clear, believable explanation. And a to-do would be to ask your frontline staff, what 3 things are we telling you to tell the customer that you can't defend? Because if they can't defend it, they're probably saying, yeah, that is a stupid policy. I work for a stupid company, which demoralizes them and confirms to the customer that the company doesn't really care about customer experience. Also, we find a lot of people talk about doing heroics to create delight. My favorite example is Chick-fil-A, which has now hired your grandmother to cruise the dining room, pouring sweet tea and saying, oh, would you like a few more fries? And her job description is to create microbursts of emotional connection in 20 to 40 seconds. So identify ways of creating that microburst, and one of the best ways is proactive education, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, technology is key to being proactive, and the basic example here is Amazon. When you order a book from Amazon, they would say, okay, what's your next question going to be? When are you going to ship it? When am I going to get it? They automatically send you the email. If they had to call you each time and say, we're shipping it on Tuesday, you should get it on Thursday, they would have been out of business a long time ago. Technology has to anticipate when the customer is going to have questions or needs and automatically transmit that information to the customer. And this is the crux of being proactive, and we'll talk about more examples in a minute. Now, the great customer experience is worth the investment in the technology and in listening to the customer to identify those opportunities to use technology, because the revenue implications and word of mouth implications are 10 to 20 times the required investment. And then finally, the voice of the customer is more than surveys and complaints. And the simplest example of this is Federal Express. FedEx knows 10 hours before you do that the package isn't going to arrive because a container of packages missed a flight in Memphis. And then they get the frantic phone call, and then 2 days later they do the satisfaction survey. The operations data that said that container missed the flight, the complaint phone call, and the survey are all describing the same set of events. Some are leading indicators, some are lagging indicators. So if you can take that operations data and look at it and understand the implications for the customer, you have, in fact, a more accurate description of the customer experience than the surveys and complaints give you, because you know that there were 200 packages in that container that missed a flight. You get 50 phone calls and 20 surveys. So if one is actually trying to size the size of the customer problem, your operations data is dramatically more accurate than even the surveys or complaints. And as I've said, customer behavior applies both to consumers and business to business. What we find is employees may cause 20% of dissatisfaction. Customers making mistakes and doing dumb things cause 30%. And the company builds unpleasant surprises in terms of broken processes and products and services that don't meet expectations. Or marketing, we are now finding, also has a significant contribution to customer dissatisfaction. I have a new article that hopefully is going to be coming out soon in Quality Progress that talks about applying quality to marketing and sales, which is the new frontier. Our argument is that if you can identify where customers are going to make mistakes in advance, you can prevent at least 30% of all their errors, therefore having a better customer experience and dramatically lowering your service expense. Also, implication for voice of the customer is that a lot of customers don't complain. There is an iceberg effect. A bunch complain to your frontline touch points, but only very few actually complain to management. So if you're going to take contact data and merge it with survey data or operations data, you have to scale it up by what we call the multiplier. We got 20 complaints. We know that there's a 5-to-1 ratio between how many problems there are and complaint rates out there. Therefore, we have to multiply the 20 by 5, and really there were 100 customers who had that problem. So you and your management need to understand that there is this iceberg effect. Now, another key impact of problems is impact on sensitivity to price. This data shows that if customers have had no problem recently, only about 10% of them are going to say, you know, your prices seem kind of high. The minute they have one problem, sensitivity to price doubles. If they have two problems, it doubles again. And so when you're interpreting your voice of the customer data, you need to be able to understand and communicate to finance that problems beget sensitivity to price and constrain your margins. Now, another part of customer experience is when customers have been delighted. And what we find is that the biggest single delighter is proactively providing information to the customer on how to avoid problems. And in marketing and sales hate that idea, but in fact, you can get a 30-point top box lift. Now, with all this background from customer behavior, we add to that the fact that if you have a great customer experience, you foster a lot of positive word of mouth, which then eliminates the need for marketing to spend a lot of time and money bringing in new customers. So great service and word of mouth do the heavy lifting, which in companies, for instance, like the Cheesecake Factory, their marketing expense is only 25% that of their competitors because, to quote their president, we let our customers do our marketing for us. And all this can be quantified. Now, to be proactive, and again, the basic point here is you want to use the voice of the customer to identify opportunities to be proactive. Being proactive means that you control the situation by causing action rather than waiting to respond. Amazon automatically sends the email to you saying when they're going to ship it, rather than waiting for you to send them a query. I've already talked about the FedEx approach where you know what's going to happen. We also find that you can predict what's going to happen. For instance, at Harley-Davidson, they know if you're storing your bike outside in the winter, your battery will be dead that first nice day in March. So in February, they send you an email saying, we know from your zip code you're in the north and you're probably storing your bike outside. Your battery will be dead. But if you buy this $40 charger off our website, you can bring your battery in, charge it, and you'll be all set to go that first nice day in spring. So they make extra money from the email selling you the charger, and they eliminate the dissatisfaction. So the benefits of being proactive is that it costs 1/3 as much, it eliminates customer uncertainty and makes you easy to do business with, it fixes problems you would otherwise not hear about, and it eliminates employee frustrations, because employees are very frustrated dealing with the same repetitive problem that is preventable. And in fact, our data shows that 50% of turnover among good employees is due to, I'm not getting paid enough to take all this crap. You can either do two things. You can pay them a lot more, or you can reduce the frustrations. A couple of very quick examples, and again, the whole theory is that by understanding the voice of the customer and where the customer has uncertainty and questions, you can then proactively answer it. And Domino's had to back away from the 30-minute guaranteed delivery because of accidents and liability, but what they found was the customer didn't really need it exactly in 30 minutes. What they wanted to know is, when is my pizza going to arrive? So now you have the Domino's tracker, which is in multiple languages around the world, and you can see exactly where your pizza is. Intuit at Quicken Loans actually has a more sophisticated example, because getting a home mortgage is very high stress. And again, they've taken their internal systems and opened it up to the customer so the customer can see exactly where they are in the process. And if you look at the lower left-hand side, it also says you have no documents to return, because one of the big unpleasant surprises is 2 days before closing, someone says, oh, and by the way, we're missing this document, and now there's consternation, and in many cases the closing had to be rescheduled. So again, opening your systems up to the customer based on what customer sources of uncertainty and angst are will immediately allow you to be more responsive. So the point is that the voice of the customer will identify all these opportunities for eliminating uncertainty and problems, and then these types of systems allow you to proactively eliminate them. Another example of this, of proactive education mitigating points of pain, this is in a Mercedes dealership. We find that one of the biggest points of pain is you get your car repaired, you're handed the invoice, and the invoice at the top says labor rate $110 an hour. And the standard reaction from most customers is, that's outrageous. But this is a 6-foot sign in the waiting area that says our hourly rate is only $110 an hour, and here's all the stuff you're getting, a bunch of loaners and genuine parts and diagnostic equipment. And by the way, if you read at the bottom, it says your local plumber is $165 an hour. We're cheap. The best defense is a good offense. So your voice of the customer process needs to be listening for all this. One last example, and then we'll get into the measurement issues, is Federal Express has found that if you warn customers about what the rules are, they'll play by the rules. They cringe when I say this, but here is an extract from their website where they say, here's what we do to smash your package. It's dropped, there's a vibration in the belly of an airplane, et cetera, et cetera. The next page is, here are your responsibilities as a customer for preventing damage to your shipment. Customers will play by the rules if they're told what the rules are. Now, to measure the customer experience, there are 6 big opportunities. The data sources that you use, and I've alluded extensively to that already, data collection, data integration, the analysis, the reporting and packaging, and then action planning. Now, the first issue is the sources. Everyone views surveys as the big input. But in fact, what we find is that, yes, surveys are very important, but there's a bunch of alternatives, and we'll also talk about some of the challenges in using surveys. Focus groups are very, very useful, but again, they're not statistically projectable. One of the cardinal sins people do is they say we had a focus group of 10 people and 70% of them said this. That's false accuracy. Social media, what we find is only about 3% of Americans are going social immediately, but if the company stonewalls them, then there's a high probability they will go social and they'll go after this revenge, which you saw on our RAGE study. About 24% of people now actually decide that they want revenge. Customer contacts are another very useful source. Call monitoring. Most people are monitoring telephone calls, but they never analyze those calls as to what was the cause and how could this have been prevented. They're totally focused on did Mary Lou answer the call effectively, when in fact the most important data is why were we getting this call and how could it have been prevented. And you also should tie your call monitoring data to the survey results. So if we're giving this call a 75, what score does the customer give it? And ideally those two should be congruent. Another source of data, a la my FedEx example, are transaction failures. In many cases you get a better picture of the size of the problem than you do through surveys because you know exactly how many packages missed the flight. If you have system outages, you know that a set of ATMs were down for 2 hours and you know 1,000 people use that part of the system each hour, you know that 2,000 people were inconvenienced. Also, something that almost no one ever looks at are website search failures. And everything that somebody searches for and gets the answer, no results found, or they answer on a survey, that was not helpful, you know they're going to now pick up the phone and call. So looking at your website search failures is a laundry list of everything that should be on your website that's not. And again, our data shows, especially millennials, who's now the largest segment of the population, that most of the rest of us also go to the website to self-service before they pick up the phone and call. So if your website is responsive to the search failures, then you're going to have dramatically less customer input. Your final source of really good information is from your employees. Your frontline employees know all the things that customers don't understand that in fact are confusing the customer. Let's see. Do we have any, I'm going to stop and take a breath. Do we have any questions or complaints at this point? Okay, let me go on. And I don't see anybody putting anything in on chat, or else you can interrupt just directly if you want. Okay, how does one go about integrating the different kinds of data? Because one of the challenges I alluded to earlier is that there are multiple touch points, and each touch point is somewhat representative, but not totally representative of customer experience. And a way of illustrating how one can do this, let's use the airlines because they're an easy target. And let's say you had 100 customers encountering a rude gate agent. What we find is 90% never complain anywhere. But 2.5%, or 1 out of 40, will complain to customer relations. 5% will tweet about it, and 1 out of 500 will send a nasty email to an executive. So the way one identifies this multiplier in terms of for customer relations, if for each one we get there are 40 other cases in the marketplace. So the way one gets this estimate of the multiplier is you go to a sample of your customers and you say, have you had any problems? What were the problems? Did you complain? Where did you complain? And by asking those 4 questions, you can get this type of a tree diagram, which will tell you for significant problems, what is the multiplier based on each touch point? And so in this case, again, we had 100 people had the problem, and 10% complained somewhere, and 2.5% complained to customer relations. So we know that for each complaint to customer relations, there are 40 others in the marketplace because we got 2.5 complaints to customer relations. Or we got 5 complaints on social media, and we know that multiplier would be 20 to 1. What one then can then do is take your actual touchpoint data and extrapolate to the marketplace. In this case, we got 16 complaints to customer relations. We know that the multiplier is in the range of 40. This is not an exact science. And so we multiply 40 times 16, and so we can say, okay, we got 16 complaints at customer relations. That would imply 640 instances in the marketplace. We got 2 nasty emails to executives, and we know that the multiplier is about 500 to 1. That would imply 1,000 instances in the marketplace. We had 30 calls to reservations. We know their multiplier is about 25 to 1. In other words, 4% of people would go to reservations and report a complaint. That would imply 750 instances in the marketplace. So we now have 6 different estimates of the instances in the marketplace, and this is an inexact science. You take an average of them and you can say, okay, last month at O'Hara we probably had about 750 customers who encountered rude gate agents. The damage at the bottom of the chart is 20% if you encounter a rude gate agent. The average customer is worth $4,000, so the current level of rudeness in O'Hara is costing us about $600,000 per month in revenue. So you're taking your 16 calls to customer relations, your 2 emails, and your 30 calls to reservations and extrapolating it to the marketplace. So this is an example of how you can integrate different kinds of data to come up with a unified picture of the customer experience. Now, in terms of data collection with surveys, one of the challenges that we find is that most organizations do a random sample of all transactions. And the problem with that is 70 to 80% of the transactions are no-brainers that anyone could have handled. And so you are wearing out your welcome with that customer, and you're really learning nothing from the survey. So our suggestion is, and we're now seeing a trend toward this, that rather than surveying everything in sight, survey only important transactions. And if they're important transactions, you can actually survey the same customer multiple times in a month, and they'll be willing to tell you if they're important transactions that are high involvement. The other critical thing is, and this drops to the bottom of the page, you have to tell them what has been done with previous feedback. It's not necessarily, we got your complaint on this and here's what we've done. It's in the last month, here are 3 improvements that we have made based on your customer input. That's the royal you. And what we find is that if your invitation to the survey states a couple of specific things that you've done to improve service, all of a sudden you'll see your response rates go up because, oh, I'm willing to spend the time if you're actually going to be using the data. Now, another challenge that we're seeing over the past year is enterprise feedback management systems. These are the large survey systems that basically if it moves, it gets measured, everything gets sent a survey. And part of the problem, and I'm probably going to make a few people mad by saying this, is that it basically says buy one of these software packages, you can survey everything in sight, and you as a manager don't need to think anymore, because it'll allow you to tie data back to Mary Lou and Sam, the frontline reps. Well, there are 2 problems with that. Number one, you do need to think, and if anything, the more data you have, the more analysis you have to do to pick your battles. But number 2, focusing on Sam and Mary Lou, the frontline rep, is exactly the worst place to focus because in most cases, 95% of the time, they're telling the customer exactly what you told them to tell the customer. The 2 much bigger opportunities are, do we have response rules and contact and service center processes that are broken that need to be improved? And do we have marketing setting incorrect expectations or operations not delivering on reasonable expectations? So it's the corporate major corporate processes where the big opportunities are to improve the customer experience. So focusing on Mary Lou, the frontline rep, which is where most companies focus most of their time, is focusing your resources in exactly the wrong place, I would argue. And we actually have a paper entitled Treating Employees as Customers that talks about how you start moving away from just focusing on Mary Lou, the frontline rep. We also have a new paper on redefining the voice of the customer that gives some of the same commentary on enterprise feedback management systems. Another critical thing that's atypical is, as was alluded to in the introduction, most surveys start off saying everything's okay, isn't it? And that puts the customer off because you're sounding complacent. A much better approach, which is the approach that we at CCMC take, is we start off saying when a customer has an ongoing relationship, stuff happens, here's a list of 50 problems you might have had. Now, marketing and sales hate that, but when you lead with problems, you immediately engage the customer, you get a much higher response rate, and it gives the customer hope that you're really going to attack some of the problems. And so that's one of the reasons why we think you get a higher response rate. Now, we've actually found that leading with problems, you can even do this with smartphones. We've recently completed surveys in Bolivia and Colombia where you ask each type of problem and you take the customer through the entire life cycle, from pre-purchase inquiry to purchase and sale to delivery and onboarding and then use of the product. And by taking them through the whole life cycle, you can identify areas that normally are not top of mind or that people are too polite to talk about. We have found that the types of issues that do the most damage to customer loyalty are sales and marketing issues where you have misled the customer or failed to warn them about limitations on the product. For instance, with an insurance company recently, we had two categories in the problem list that were I was misled by your agent, I was misled by your literature. And I get a phone call from the Deputy General Counsel who says, you can't have those on the list because if anybody checks them off, we've committed fraud. My answer back is, would you rather not know? And what we find is, just like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to complain about your service technician because you're dependent upon them. You have exactly the same thing in terms of people are too polite to talk about that you misled me or you lied to me or you weren't responsive or you're not the smartest person to deal with. But once they're on the list, the customer will tell you about it. And you can then ask open-ended questions that say, please describe, and then you use text analytics to analyze it. And what you will find is that the damage done by sales and marketing problems is 4 times that of operational issues. Now, another issue that we find that is, again, the latest fad is to use a 1 to 10 scale and a net promoter score, and I'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes. But we basically find that a 5-point scale with labeling works just as well as a 10-point scale. We believe that the 10-point scale is gilding the lily and really doesn't give you very much more differentiation. And in fact, it can be misleading because all of us grew up in elementary school where a 70 was passing and an 80 was good. So a lot of people are still focusing just on the 6 and above categories and not really using the other one. And again, the critical thing is in the invitation you need to say, here's what we've done with feedback in the past. Now, in terms of analysis, the critical analysis that most people need to do is a key driver analysis to say, okay, what's the payoff if we move this dimension or this part of service up by 5 or 10%? And what we find is that you should always do a analysis with a stepwise regression to see what is the R squared, which is how much of the variation in satisfaction or willing to purchase are the dimensions that you are measuring actually contributing. And what we find is a lot of people are using surveys that only explain a third to a half of the variation, which means you're not measuring the stuff that's really important to the customer. So you should always do some type of a stepwise regression to see how much of the variation in your output variable, which would be willingness to recommend or willingness to keep buying or overall satisfaction, how much of that is explained by what you're measuring. Another interesting thing, going back to problems, we find that if a customer has had a problem, all of a sudden the drivers change dramatically. It's no longer the niceness of your sales rep, it's the decisiveness of the service system. It's what have you done for me lately? So we basically find for most companies there is not one set of drivers of satisfaction. There are two sets. The first is if I've had no problem. The second set is if I have had a problem. And very few organizations do a dual analysis of drivers based on problem versus no problem, which I've already alluded to. You need to calculate how much revenue is at risk and how much word of mouth is at risk if we don't fix each of these problems. We find that to tell people, hey, we have this problem, people will wring their hands, but if you say for each month we don't take action on this problem, it's costing us $10 million, all of a sudden you have created the economic imperative for action. I've mentioned sensitivity to price. We find that CFOs are very interested in enhancing margins, and so if you say these kind of problems create significantly more sensitivity to price, all of a sudden the CFO is going to jump on also. We also find that the analysis, the person doing the voice of the customer analysis should put forth a plan to verify the stated intentions. For instance, a lot of finance people will say, well, the customer said he's not going to buy again. Are they really going to not buy? One example of where we did this was with an airline where we had frequent flyers, and we then took the survey responses from 7,000 frequent flyers, and then we looked at their behavior 6 months and a year out, and what we found was half the people who said, I've had it with you, I'm not flying you again, in fact had precipitous drops in miles flown. So finance people want you to verify that if somebody says they're not going to buy from you again, look at their account and see if they have bought. In some companies it's hard to do that. In many companies you can verify the impact. One last observation on analysis is everybody fawns over their gold customers, but I would argue you're getting all the revenue from your gold customers you're going to, and more than likely you're giving them a heck of a discount. But your silver and bronze customers may be someone else's gold customers. So we see in most cases the silver and bronze customers are the biggest opportunity, and you should look at an analysis of their experience separately. And in one airline we found that by dealing with the bronze customers and just fixing 2 of their points of pain, we were able to recoup over $300 million in incremental revenue. Now, how one will, let me just check and see if we have questions. Oh, okay. One of the questions that we've gotten is the survey that you described with the problem sounds long. Don't people hate long surveys and refuse to complete them? In fact, what we have found is that if this survey looks like it's actually going to be productive and is relevant to me and allowing me to talk about specific problems that I've had, we find that in fact you can get a 20 to 30% response rate on these types of surveys, as opposed to most surveys are lucky now if they get a 5 to 10% response rate. Another question is, how would you figure out what the multiplier is, or is this guesswork? The best way of getting the multiplier is, and in fact this chart we have is sort of a good illustration of it, is you go to a random sample of your customers. In the ideal world, if you got a bunch of customers, I would go to at least 1,000 customers and say, have you had any recent problems? What was most serious? Did you contact us? And who did you contact, and how well did we handle it? And what you basically find is you'll get a chart that looks like this. In this case, we had 20% of customers said they had a problem, and 25% of them actually contacted somebody for assistance. Now, to get fancy to develop the multiplier, you would then say, okay, where did they complain? And you would have multiple places they might have complained. For this overall economic modeling, right now what we would say is the multiplier for this company as a whole is 4 to 1. For each complaint we get, there's 4 out there. And that's the 25 versus the 75%, contactors versus non-contactors. Now, if somebody contacts, 50% are satisfied, and if you go to the second column, you see definitely will keep repurchasing, you have 90%. And this is in fact one of the things that instigated the creation of the GE Answer Center. We found that if people had a problem, complained, and were satisfied, their loyalty in many cases was actually higher than if they had had no problem whatsoever. And if you look at the right-hand column, that 1.7 people on average were being told positive things about the company. If you drop down to dissatisfied, 20% were dissatisfied, their loyalty dropped to 70%, and they were telling a median of 5.5 people bad things about the company. Now, the thing that is most important in terms of getting the resources to invest in an aggressive voice of the customer process is the bottom line, which is the 75% non-contactors, where you have damage to loyalty goes down to 75% loyalty, and they're still telling 2.9 people on average bad things about the company. Now, once you have this kind of a chart, A, you've got a rough multiplier, which for your contact data would be 4 to 1 in this case, and B, you have the ability to now create an economic model such as this, where you basically show that we have 200,000 customers with problems, 25% complain, 50% are satisfied, 90% are going to repurchase, which means we have 10% who won't repurchase, and that's 2,500 customers. For the dissatisfied, you have 20% dissatisfied, you have 30% attrition there, and that's another 3,000 customers. But the thing that shocks finance and marketing people is the bottom line, where you have the 75% who don't complain, you're losing 25% of them, and that's 37,000 customers at risk. So of the 46,000 at risk, 37,000 never even bothered to contact you. And at $1,000 per customer, that then implies you, for each month you don't solve this, you're leaving $46 million on the table, which then implies 3 strategies. Ideally, you want to prevent problems. Let's get that 200,000 customers with problems down. Let's get more people to complain. It's better to hear from a customer than to not hear. And if they do complain, let's improve their response. Now, one quick example, and again, we have a whole paper entitled Selling Service and Quality to the CFO. And again, just send me an email to my address, which you'll see at the end, and I'll be happy to send it to you. But the quick example here is we've reduced the 200,000 customers with problems to 150,000. We now find the total customers at risk has gone from 46,000 to 34,000, which adds 11 million to the top line. Plus, it prevents 12,000 phone calls. And if we spend $1 million on this prevention, which could be the proactive communication, it could be the FedEx education, the Mercedes-Benz, here's why we have a $110 labor rate. That type of education gives us an ROI of 187%. And this chart also passes the Katie test. Katie was my 9-year-old daughter. The theory was if she couldn't understand it, no CFO could understand it. When I said that to the CFO of Nationwide Insurance, he laughed and he said, "You're right, it's an attention span issue." So this is one way of educating finance people. You can do exactly the same kind of an analysis at the individual problem level. This is from very old data from Motorola. They've been nice enough to let me share it. It's actually, this chart's in my book also. And what you see is certain problems do damage. Meeting promise delivery dates, where the salesman lied to get the order, is putting 1.3% of total customers at risk, while product availability within desired time frame is not doing any damage. Now, this is where the customer says, "I need this in 2 weeks," and you look at your inventory and say, "Honestly, I'm sorry, we can't deliver in 2 weeks." And This company was about to spend millions of dollars raising inventories until we looked at how many people said, well, I wouldn't buy from you, or I wouldn't recommend you. And what we found was people basically said, look, if it's a 4-week time horizon, as long as you tell me that, I'm willing to live with it. So spending millions of dollars raising inventories was not a good use of their money. On the other hand, unreturned phone calls from sales reps, the bottom line, did 33% damage on a per problem basis and was putting 2.4% of their total customer base at risk. So there are squeaky wheels that don't deserve grease, but you can't tell that until you do an analysis of what's the revenue impact of different problems. And again, you need the granularity to be able to differentiate between problems doing damage and problems that aren't. Now, next to the last area is reporting for impact. What we find is that most voice of the customer reports are big, thick reports, and somebody has to read, and it's sent to the entire company, so everybody has to read through the 10 pages to find the 2 pages that apply to them. We suggest you simplify for each functional area the voice of the customer report to the 3 key issues and eliminate the masses of data that require interpretation. You also tailor the voice of the customer report to each function, and to quote Chip Horner from Colgate-Palmolive, he holds a meeting with each functional area to look into their eyes to see if they have absorbed the information. Now that's more work, tailoring the report and holding a meeting, but the impact of the voice of the customer goes up dramatically. Also, you should act as an internal consultant to the rest of the organization and not just say, here's the data, you got a problem, have a nice day, but you know your operation better than I do, but if I were you, I would do this. And you provide the action plan, and even offer, and Wegmans does this, the head of service quality at Wegmans says, and I'll help you pilot test it. Let's design a pilot test for each issue. And we find that that dramatically reduces cycle time if you provide an action plan and even a design for a test. You've got to humanize the data with quotes to say we had 85 customers who had this issue is interesting, but if you then have some quotes or ideally a WAV file from a call where the customer's angst comes through in the recording, you have dramatically more impact. FedEx found that having humanized data along with the statistics dramatically increased the impact of the voice of the customer. Another thing is, most voice of the customer's reports are saying who screwed up this month, and that creates defensiveness. So rather than criticizing, the tone of the voice of the customer should be, hey, you're doing well, but look how much money is being left on the table. So we find greed works really well. I had a Toyota dealership in northern New Jersey who looked exactly like Tony out of The Sopranos, and he said, you know, I think all this customer experience stuff is a bunch of crap, but if it'll make me more money, I'll do it. Greed works. So show them how much money is being left on the table, and identify opportunities to proactively warn the customer and prevent issues. And again, this is why I started off talking about the proactivity, because you can look at a customer journey map and identify exactly where the opportunities to be proactive are, dramatically reducing your service transactions and dazzling the customer and eliminating unpleasant surprises. Now, one thing that's used a lot is Net Promoter Scores, and the new latest fad is customer effort. One of my classmates at Harvard Business School is actually one of the guys who came up with the whole concept of dashboards, and my problem is that I think dashboards are for lazy executives who don't want to know the details. But the problem is with Net Promoter is that you take the 9s and 10s, subtract the 6s and belows, and what you're left with is a net number of promoters, but that ignores the 7s and 8s, which in most companies is 50 or 60% of the total marketplace. So you need to analyze what's causing each of those 3 categories, and you're going to have 3 different strategies. Customer effort, I don't have a huge problem with, except that most service areas don't own the website, and everybody goes to the website first. So the biggest part of their customer effort is, I was looking on your website and couldn't find what I was looking for. And in most cases, that's not even due to the fault of that's not due to the fault of the service area. We had a question here that says, I talked about the average value of the customer. Shouldn't you quantify the value by segment? Yes, ideally you should have a value for gold, silver, bronze, and lead customers. The problem is that that's honestly too complicated for most companies. At one of the big copier companies, we basically said the average customer was worth $25,000, so management could do the math in their head. This issue is putting 1,000 customers at risk times 25,000. Hey, that's a $25 million problem. So in the ideal world, you would want to quantify by segment, but we just find that unfortunately is too complicated for most of the world. The paper that I mentioned earlier was Selling Quality and Service to the CFO. That is a paper that is also available on our website, or I'd be happy to send you afterward. Now, let me get out of that and go back to this. Now, the last big opportunity is action planning. What we find is that most of the world does a presentation of the report, and everybody then goes away and is supposed to do their thing. What we find is critically important is that the voice of the customer process should first educate people, all the different functions, what we call a roundtable briefing, to socialize the data from the voice of the customer. Then you need executives to say, okay, out of these 15 issues, here are the 4 that we want to prioritize. Then you have an action planning session, and the critical thing here is almost every corporate issue that causes a problem is cross-functional. The problem may surface in operations, or it may surface in service, but in fact, sales and marketing had something to do, the onboarding people did, there's field operations, so almost every significant issue is cross-functional. And if everyone's responsible, no one's responsible. So the action planning session takes the top issues that have been prioritized by the executives and says, okay, we realize that this is a function of all 4 of you activities. One person's going to take the lead. And we suggest that the voice of the customer process anoint one of the functional areas as being the lead function for resolving that particular issue. And what you do is you spread the pain around, so each of the functions is responsible for something, but the critical thing is to make one function responsible for taking the lead for resolving each issue. Then you do action planning, and where the implementation takes place, you document, tell me what you've done. We find in a lot of organizations just filing your action plan and you're done is enough, but that isn't enough. And then every voice of the customer issue that's raised and made a priority, you should identify what are the process metrics that need to be tracked that will tell us whether the issue is getting better before we do another survey. Because a lot of the world waits and says, oh, we've got to wait till we do another survey, but that's going to be 6 months or a year down the road, and what happens if nothing has changed? So you need process metrics that within weeks or days will tell you whether or not things have actually gotten better. And then the other key role of the voice of the customer process is to report which issues have actually gotten fixed and which haven't been fixed. Which leads to these 8 key points, a checklist for having an effective voice of the customer process. One person, you, should be the owner of the process, and your job is not only to come up with a unified collection plan, item 2, but also to identify who should be assigned to each issue. If you have the unified data collection plan across contacts, operational data, surveys, social media, you're then in a position using rough estimates of the multiplier to integrate the data in step 3 and come up with granular findings on these are the big issues that are driving customers nuts. Step 5 is that you Identify how much revenue and profit is at risk for each month an action isn't taken. Again, if you can create the incentive, the economic imperative for action by quantifying the cost of inaction, you get people to move. You have a formal process where, again, the voice of the customer should be translating the data into, you know your operation better than I do, but if I were you, I would take this action. You make recommendations. The VOC system then says, did the issue get fixed? You're tracking the impact of the VOC, and the best companies actually have performance metrics that evaluate each functional executive on their responsiveness to the issues raised by the voice of the customer process. And again, we find these 4 areas, the unified collection, the integration, the granular reporting and packaging, and then the profit calculations or profit impact are the areas that are the most challenging. We also have a paper, surprise, surprise, that describes this. And again, just send me an email if you'd like a description of how to do all 8 of these things. Now, to get started, the first thing you need to do is analyze your service workload and customer problems and identify which ones are customer caused, which ones are process caused, marketing and sales, and broken processes. Identify the top 10 questions and ask yourself which of these can be anticipated or prevented. And just identify a couple of those and work with your CIO to start warning customers in advance. And again, the simplest example is Amazon. They knew when you ordered the book, your question was going to be, when are you going to ship it? When am I going to get it? Build that into the process. Take action. Educate customers on the top 3 mistakes. Very much like my Mercedes-Benz, here's why we charge $110 an hour for labor. Fix one process to give employees hope. The minute you fix one process that's driving the employees nuts as well as the customers, all of a sudden your employees will become your best consultants and continue to give you a lot more suggestions for process fixes. Then create a cross-functional customer experience steering committee that does the end-to-end customer journey map and starts identifying all the places where you can be proactive and preventive. This concept of proactivity I call psychic pizza. I ring your doorbell and say, here is the pizza you were about to order. By doing that, I dazzle your socks off and I eliminate the service transaction. So hopefully we have stimulated your thinking in a number of areas. And number 1, understand that there's a non-complaint rate, especially in the business-to-business environment. So your customer contacts are only the tip of the iceberg, and you need to use a multiplier to extrapolate. On your surveys, aid the customer with a problem list. You will get a lot more granularity and actually a higher response rate because you're giving the customer hope. We had at Harley-Davidson, we had several customers who, pardon my French, said, finally somebody sent me a no-bullshit survey. It looks like you guys really want to solve problems. You want to create a unified voice of the customer to identify the best opportunities using surveys, contacts, operations data, and employee input. Quantify the revenue at risk for each month to create the economic imperative. Act as a consultant and provide the recipient of the voice of the customer report with a suggested action plan. And then figure out how to use technology to proactively educate, connect, explain, and deliver psychic pizza. So hopefully we have stimulated everybody's thinking in a number of areas. This is my email address for both working papers or complaints. We always solicit complaints. And you can follow me on Twitter at jgoodman888, and I'm actually going to be coming out with a new paper in the next week with 12 of our most famous quotes that seem to get people's attention. So hopefully we have stimulated your thinking in a number of areas. And John, let me turn it back over to you to see if we have anything more to say.
Well, thank you, John. I know we're right there at the end of the hour. I don't know if anyone has any remaining questions. If you do, go ahead and please shoot them over. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and give our conclusion here and thank John for addressing this informative and interesting topic. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available within a few days. On behalf of the Minnesota chapter of ASQ, we would like to thank you all for your responses and for attending this webinar today. In departing, we invite you to attend our next webinar titled High Performance Teams Are Essential to Concurrent Product Development Success on Wednesday, May 11th at 12 p.m. Central Time. Seeing no additional questions, I'm going to wrap it up and let everyone get on with their day. Thank you all so very much.